Fire breaks out in the cabin of a DC-9. The pilots lose control, and the plane plunges nose first into the Everglades.
That nose drop occurred. I realized it was going to crash.
An MD-11 crashes after smoke mysteriously fills the cockpit.
The airplane was burning up around him.
2.5 hours into a flight, a DC-9 fills with smoke and loses all of its electrical systems.
So Mayday are going down.
We thought everybody could get out because, like I said, there wasn't any screen.
And moments after takeoff, flames erupt from the world's most iconic aircraft.
It was a time bomb. They were going to die.
People watch in horror as it crashes into a nearby hotel. There are many ways for fires to start on a plane. There are not many ways to put them out.
In-flight fires can be one of the most catastrophic events a flight crew can face.
The United States Federal Aviation Administration has found that nearly one flight a day is diverted due to smoke or fire in flight. It can be one of the most dangerous situations facing any flight crew.
The FAA has done extensive testing on in-flight fires, and the research said you may have as little as 20 minutes to get the fire under control, or you may lose control of the airplane.
Over the years, aircraft have become heavily protected against fire. Materials are tested for flammability. Smoke detectors are installed throughout. But these precautions are the product of hard lessons. Fires often start in areas of the plane that are not visible to the crew. Dramatic animations show where these hidden infernos can start, making you an eyewitness to the disaster unfolding. And it can unfold very quickly, as in the case of an MD-11 that crashed into the Atlantic Ocean minutes after smoke entered the cockpit. September the 2nd, 1998, passengers on board Swissair Flight 111 are making their way from New York to Geneva. The plane is over the Canadian coast when the pilots smell smoke in the cockpit. Bill Pickrell is the air traffic controller that day, and the last person to have contact with Flight 111.
We were at the end of the shift. At approximately 10:15 p.m. local time, we were advised by one of the other sectors in the center that a Swissair flight had declared a pan because of smoke in the cockpit.
A pan call indicates urgency that is not immediately life-threatening. As a precaution, Swissair 111 is cleared for an emergency landing at Halifax Airport in Nova Scotia.
It appeared initially to be a fairly straightforward operation. The radio transmission was very professional, very calm. There was no indication of a sense of urgency.
As they prepare for their descent, the smoke in the cockpit becomes heavier. Amid the growing danger, the pilots are faced with a difficult decision.
The pilot advised that they needed to dump fuel. At that point, they were approximately 16,000 feet. The fuel dump complicated the situation greatly.
It's a good decision to get the airplane as light as you can. It's easier on the airplane.
But delaying the landing could put the flight in even more danger. The passengers have been told that they are being diverted, but there is no smoke in the cabin, and they have no idea that inside the cockpit something is going horribly wrong. Following the smoke checklist, the pilots shut off power to the cabin. If there's an electrical fire, this could cut power to the source, but the smoke only gets thicker. Then, the autopilot fails. Flying the plane by hand in the dark, the pilots put on their oxygen masks.
At this point, they knew they had a very serious situation. They needed on the ground as rapidly as possible.
As soon as they were over the water was when I suggested that they could commence their fuel dump. And that was also the time, unknown to me, that the aircraft began experiencing a series of critical systems failures.
The plane begins to lose altitude.
Within a minute, they had lost several critical systems. They lost the radio contact, and very soon after that, we lost the transponder.
Inside the cockpit, a nightmare scenario is unfolding. Fire has breached the ceiling, dripping molten aluminium onto the flight deck. They lose control of the plane and plunge into the ocean at 345 miles an hour. The impact is tremendous. There are no survivors. The plane shatters and only small traces remain floating on the surface. The rest disappears into the Atlantic. It is clearly now not a rescue mission, but a recovery mission. Puzzled by the tragedy, investigators are eager to retrieve the wreckage.
We knew that if we found the source of that in-flight fire and the fuel that was feeding that in-flight fire, that we would get to the safety issues that we needed to identify.
But the answers to questions about how it started and what burned are scattered on the ocean floor.
Some 185 or 90 feet below the surface of the ocean and spread out, and we didn't know exactly where it was. We didn't know exactly what we were faced with in trying to recover it.
The first challenge is to find the black boxes.
We managed to go in and locate and recover the two black boxes. It was a setback because the fire, in fact, had burned both of those flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder about 6 minutes before the aircraft actually hit the water. It was pretty disappointing.
With no new information about the final 6 minutes, investigators are forced to rely on the wreckage for answers.
It's not necessarily standard practice to rebuild an airplane to be able to solve the riddle of what happened. In our particular case, that was really the only way we were going to be able to do it, was to take the pieces that we were able to recover and then identify and place them back into a structure that resembled the original airplane. So we could basically look for fire patterns on the burn pieces that we had and then try and trace the fire to its origin.
But how could fire breach the cockpit, the most protected area of the aircraft? The answers shocked the aviation industry.
We had indications that there was insulation cover material in the airplane that had burned. It didn't look like this stuff should burn at all. But we said very quickly after that this material is what spread the fire, what made it so hot, and in fact what made that airplane crash into the ocean.
In 1998, thousands of planes were taken to the skies full of the same insulation.
There was fire damage in the area over the flight deck, and this surprised them because there's testing done to ensure that these thermal acoustic blankets do not burn easily, and yet there was fire damage.
We took some of this material and touched a match to it, and lo and behold, we discovered that it burned. Not only did it burned completely, and it burned hot, and it burned smoky.
Investigators race to find out what ignited the insulation before another aircraft is affected. Coming up, will millions of pieces of wreckage yield answers before it's too late? Swiss Air Flight 111 on its way from New York to Geneva falls from the sky and into the Atlantic Ocean near Nova Scotia, just minutes after the crew reports smoke in the cockpit. In the search to find out what went wrong, investigators discover that a common aircraft insulation material is a fire hazard. Thousands of planes are refitted with new insulation, and flammability testing is re-evaluated. But they still don't know how the fire started, and if other aircraft are at risk.
When we started to look for potential ignition sources, the very first thing that comes to mind is aircraft wiring.
The investigators scour more than 150 miles of wiring for signs of an electrical malfunction called arcing.
Arcing events are when electricity jumps from a wire to another piece of metal. It can be another wire, or it can be a part of the airplane or something else. When it does that, it can create a tremendous amount of heat.
finding an arcing event is difficult, and determining if one preceded another is nearly impossible. But 6 months into writing the final reports, the impossible happens.
We managed to come up with a wire bundle that was in fact involved in the lead event.
The investigators identified 2 microscopic points on a wire and determined that they were the first to experience a fault, but it's still unclear why they malfunctioned and how they caused the crash.
The MD-11 was one of the very early airplanes to have personal in-flight entertainment, and so in the first-class cabin area, this system drew a lot of power, and on this type of airplane, it has individual power supplies for the cabin as well as the different parts of the flight deck.
When the system was installed into the aircraft, it was wired into the cockpit, drawing power from the same source as the flight controls.
Under normal conditions, an in-flight entertainment system arcing event and fire would be controllable because they would be able to shut off electricity to it. Unfortunately, in the case of Swissair 111, they were unable to do that.
Wear and tear on the entertainment system wiring created an opening that allowed electricity to jump out. The arc occurred right next to the wires that powered the flight deck's most crucial equipment, setting off a fire that spread across the cockpit attic, burning through the ceiling.
The situation as the final few minutes of flight was catastrophic. The airplane's full of smoke. There is evidence of molten aluminum that's being rained down from the fire overhead. The electrical systems are failing. Pneumatic systems are failing. One by one, everything that they need to keep the airplane in flight is failing. And they finally lose control of the airplane, and it rolls toward the ocean and accelerates and impacts the ocean at a very high speed.
In the wake of the Swissair 111 crash, the airline industry is forced to re-evaluate the procedures for in-flight fires. Flammability testing becomes more rigorous. Insulation blankets are manufactured from more flame-resistant materials, and the certification and maintenance of wiring becomes more stringent.
The Swissair 111 was a watershed event in how pilots deal with in-flight smoke and fire conditions. After that, pilots recognized how quickly things could go wrong.
What makes fire such a lethal threat to aircraft is its ability to start and grow undetected. In some cases, the interiors of the plane are at risk, but a fire that starts outside can be just as catastrophic. Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris. Concorde, the world's only supersonic passenger jet, speeds down the runway at over 175 miles per hour. Just before the nose wheel lifts, flames erupt from under the left wing. Eyewitnesses see the low-flying plane move unsteadily through the sky, with an inferno trailing behind it. Just 2 minutes after takeoff, the most famous passenger aircraft in the world crashes into a hotel.
They were doomed. They fought until the last moment, but they could do nothing.
July the 25th, 2000. Air France Flight 4590 is preparing for takeoff from Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport on its way to New York. Other air traffic gives way, and people stop to watch as Concorde prepares for takeoff. No one realizes they're about to witness a disaster.
The airplane is going right down the runway. The tower tells the pilots, hey, you've got fire behind the aircraft. They get a cockpit warning indication that there is a fire, believed to be a fire, in the number 2 engine.
But once the plane reaches a critical speed, it cannot stop. The pilot's best hope is to get airborne so they can deal with the problem.
Typically for a pilot, whenever you have a problem and you're committed to flight, which this crew was, they want to climb to what they call a safe altitude before they really start taking corrective action.
But the Concorde's ability to fly has been compromised by the fire.
He had started to lose directional control. When you got the airplane flying, he's heavy, low, and slow. That is a very critical point for a pilot.
A minute after takeoff, the number 2 engine fails. The pilots begin to go through the engine fire procedure.
In the cockpit, they're starting to get warnings. They've been told by the control tower that they have fire. So for a pilot, they go, I have a fire in the number 2 engine.
But the situation is not what the pilots suspect. Desperately trying to get enough speed to stay airborne, they attempt to pull up the landing gear.
They selected the undercarriage up, but it wouldn't come up because the left-hand undercarriage had been damaged by the fire. They were not in a position to continue level flight, and at that point, they realized they needed on the ground at the closest airport, which was Le Bourget. It wasn't a good choice, but it was the best choice that they had.
You have a fire, and it's not just contained to the engine, it's now encompassed almost the full bottom of the left wing.
It was a plane trying to survive.
Seconds later, engine number 1 fails. The Concorde's chances of making the airfield rapidly diminish.
So now you have 2 engines trying to do the work of 4. You have an airplane that's wallowing in the air because it hasn't built up sufficient flying speed, and now all of a sudden you have a controllability issue. And you have an airplane that's on fire.
The plane became totally unflyable. The crew tried to recover by reducing the power on the 2 living engines, but it was a game of no use.
As bystanders watch in horror, the plane banks to the left and crashes into a small hotel.
It was such a huge fire that I couldn't see anything. No plane, no wreckage, no hotel.
113 people die, including 4 on the ground. The tragedy sends a shockwave through the aviation world.
Just now across the wires from Associated Press, an Air France Concorde crashes outside Paris shortly after takeoff, slamming into a hotel.
It was a scene from hell. It was absolute pandemonium. People were literally all around me shaking. We were all absolutely in shock. All we could see was a huge bonfire.
Immediately after the crash of Air France Flight 4590 outside Paris, aviation experts and investigators arrived to unearth clues from the smoldering wreckage.
It was really a nightmare. Once I was on the scene, I knew that the bodies were not there anymore, but death was everywhere.
When the flight data and voice recorders are located, investigators take them in for analysis.
2 recorders were not in excellent shape, and especially the data recorder. Initially, we learned not much. Slowly, we began to make a scenario.
The crash site is not the only place where investigators look for clues. The runway where the aircraft departed also becomes a focus. The streaks of soot and fuel on the runway indicate a fuel leakage that could have fed the raging blaze. But how did the leak start?
We found a part of the tank and small parts of the plane. We found also something which was not from the plane. It was a strip of metal. It was not a part of the Concorde, and it had nothing to do with the runway.
How this piece of metal could have contributed to the crash is unclear until another crucial clue is discovered.
You can think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. And what they found is they reassembled the tire parts that were on the runway, that the pattern matched the piece of metal. So it was consistent with the tire having rolled over this piece of metal.
The shape of the damage to the tire clearly matches the shape of the piece of metal found on the runway. Investigators examined dozens of aircraft, trying to find out where the foreign piece of debris could have come from.
They found not only the plane, they found the place where the part had been.
A Continental DC-10 is found with a wear strip missing. The strip was a reinforcement that came loose when the plane took off shortly before Concorde. Investigators are confident they have identified a crucial part of the accident sequence. But the question remains, how could a damaged tire lead to a fatal crash? Greg Feith is a crash investigator and a former consultant to Continental Airlines on an unrelated case.
At speeds of up to 200 miles an hour, when that tire blew out after striking that piece of metal, it turned to shrapnel, and those small and large fragments of rubber started to strike the bottom of the aircraft.
The rubber strikes the underside of the wing, and behind the skin of that wing is a huge fuel tank.
And these chunks of rubber hit the bottom of the fuel tank. Even though it didn't breach the fuel tank, it sent shock waves that overpressured the tank. In this case, the shock wave created an overpressure system. It's basically expanding in the tank. It blows it from inside out, creating a hole for the fuel to leak out of.
Captured on camera through the window of a passing truck, jet fuel begins spewing out of the wing and into the air, where it vaporizes and ignites. Once the fire gets going, there's no way to stop it.
As the roll picked up in magnitude, their ability to maintain level flight was degraded and the nose started down.
10 years after the crash, Continental Airlines and 2 of its employees go on trial in Paris for involuntary manslaughter. All denied the charges. Under French law, it's standard for a criminal investigation to be opened after a plane crash, but it's highly unusual for an airline to face criminal charges. During the trial, Continental says Air France knew of deficiencies in Concorde's wheels. Air France denies the allegations and maintains the accident would not have happened if the wear strip hadn't been on the runway. In the same trial, the former head of testing for Concorde, former head engineer for Concorde, and a retired civil aviation chief are also tried for involuntary manslaughter. They denied the charges. The trial debated the role of many factors, including debris on the runway, fuel load, baggage weight, scheduling pressure, and a missing tire spacer.
An accident is a series of events. All accidents are a series of events. This one was many events coming together very tragically.
Continental Airlines and one of its mechanics were found guilty of manslaughter. The trial exposed several contributory factors.
I don't think that piece of metal brought the airplane down. I think it played a factor in the cause of the accident, but I don't think it was the sole responsible cause of the accident.
Now that we know what happened, it was waiting to happen, but it needed so many extraordinary, impossible events to happen the same day at the same moment.
Even before the verdict, the aviation industry undertakes some safety changes. Debris on the runway is now seen as an even greater threat to aircraft. Concorde is refitted with burst-resistant tires, and fuel tanks are reinforced. But for Concorde, it is the beginning of the end. 3 years after the crash, the aircraft is retired.
For many people, this plane was something, was a symbol. And they lost something with the end of the Concorde story.
Coming up, moments after takeoff, fire erupts inside the cabin of a DC-9, sending it nose first into the Florida Everglades. The DC-9 takes off from Miami International Airport and begins its ascent. As it reaches 10,000 feet, fire breaks out in the cargo hold. Moments later, the pilots lose control of the plane and plunge into the Everglades.
They discovered that it had already burnt up pretty much in the sky.
11th of May 1996. Value Jet Flight 592 has just taken off from Miami, bound for Atlanta, Georgia. 6 minutes after takeoff, the pilots hear a loud noise from inside the body of the plane. Seconds later, the electrical systems fail. The first officer radios air traffic control. Jesse Fisher is on duty.
His voice was very calm, very in control. He didn't sound urgent.
While the pilots are assessing the electrical failure, smoke has started to come up through the floors of the cabin. The smoke moves into the flight deck.
And the airplane finally levels off and begins a turn, and the pilot is now a little bit more intense in his...
With no electrical systems, the pilots struggle to maintain control of the situation. As they try to make their way back towards Miami, fire begins to come up through the cabin floor.
He is more intent, so now my heart rate's up. I said, proceed direct to the airport. He said, I need vectors. And now in my mind, I'm thinking, that's not good. He's got so much smoke, he can't see his instrumentation. So I started issuing the vectors, bringing them back around. The turn was real slow coming back toward the airport. But still a lot of airspeed. At about 9,500 feet is when he says, I need the nearest airport. He's maybe 2 or 3 miles closer to Dade Collier, but at his rate of speed and altitude, he can easily make Miami. And Miami has services. We have the fire equipment, there's medical. Dade Collier is out in the Everglades, and there's nothing there.
Walton Little is fishing in the Everglades and can see that something's going very wrong for Flight 592.
When I hear the loud jet noise, I look to my left shoulder. I see a large aircraft, unusually low to the ground.
We're like, okay, this is probably going to be a crash on the airport now.
I realize that the bank angle is getting steeper and steeper, and actually approaches and exceeds 90 degrees, such that it's rolling over on its back.
When the plane banks at that angle, the wings can't provide enough lift, causing the plane to lose altitude.
If the wings are level, then 100% of the lift is counteracting gravity. When you have it at a 45-degree angle of bank, then only half of it can be counteracting the lift. So that the greater the bank angle, the less available lift there is to counteract gravity, which makes it harder to maintain altitude.
Something was changing too rapidly for the radar data to keep up with it. From 9,000 feet, I saw one more hit at 1,000 feet. Now that's bad. That's real bad. That's a rate of descent. It's like a fighter jet. That's 8,000 feet a minute, which is screaming down.
When that nose drop occurred, I realized it was going to crash.
There is no further communication from the flight.
I knew they were down, and it's a helpless feeling.
As the aircraft disappeared below the horizon, what appeared immediately afterward was a very large wave of water that rose up like a wave at a beach.
All 110 people on board are killed.
All right, we will show you a live picture of the crash scene. That area of scorched earth surrounded by water and the green Everglades around it. Very, very little left in terms of wreckage.
Investigators spend weeks combing through the swamp looking for clues.
As they found more and more of the wreckage and they were able to look in the forward cargo hold, they realized that there was a lot of fire damage in the floor of the fuselage. There was a lot of fire damage and high temperature fire.
The fire appeared to have started in the cargo hold, but no one knew how it could have spread.
These types of cargo compartments are designed to contain a fire, so why didn't the liner contain the fire?
The investigators check records to see what was being transported in the hold. They find mail, 3 tires on their way to another value jet plane, and then something suspicious.
They found that there were oxygen generators in there, and they found evidence that some of the generators had been discharged. That suddenly would explain why the containment liner had not worked.
Inside the cargo hold are the charred remains of 9 activated canisters.
Oxygen generators use a chemical process to produce oxygen in the event passengers need it during a decompression.
According to the NTSB, they were improperly secured for shipping.
It turned out it was just very apparently shoddy workmanship.
But what causes the fire? According to the NTSB, a disturbance such as a bump on the runway may have made the spring-loaded lever on the canisters hit the tiny charge on the caps. This impact creates a small explosion and starts a reaction inside the canisters. Oxygen is generated and released into the hold. The reaction also produces heat, with temperatures up to 260 degrees Celsius. The combination of heat and pure oxygen creates a voracious fire. Inside the hold, the pure oxygen allows the fire to burn through the liner and up into the cabin, melting the floor beams under the passengers' feet.
They discovered that it had already burnt up pretty much in the sky.
There was a breakdown there. There was a series of communications breakdown. A lot of safety changes came out as a result. There's absolute flat prohibition against shipping oxygen generators by air. Class D cargo compartments now have the ability to detect a fire.
Charges are brought against ValueJet's maintenance contractor, Sabertech. Sabertech ultimately pleads no contest to one state charge of mishandling hazardous waste. The company also faces 24 federal charges, but is convicted of only one: failure to train employees in handling hazardous materials. Before the cases are finished, Sabertech goes out of business. ValueJet is temporarily grounded by the FAA, but goes on to merge with AirTran Airways, and is later acquired by Southwest.
When you fly, there are so many people that affect your airplane, your safety.
A DC-9 is heading from Dallas to Toronto when the cabin and cockpit are suddenly filled with toxic smoke. The electrical systems shut down, making it nearly impossible to control the plane.
The captain was faced with an unbelievably difficult task.
Barely able to see through the thick smoke, the pilot tries to get on the ground, but passengers are already succumbing to smoke inhalation. June 2nd, 1983. Air Canada Flight 797 has a normal takeoff and climb to cruising altitude, but about 2.5 hours into the journey, the plane experiences an electrical malfunction.
I looked at the breaker. It was out. There were allowed to one reset, so I pushed it, but it didn't move, so I didn't consider that a reset.
Captain Don Cameron was at the controls that day.
Just like old days.
For the first time in decades, he is back in the cockpit of a DC-9 at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. The breakers are connected to the lavatory in the back of the plane. Once they pop out, they cut the flow of electricity to the lavatory motor.
The crew responded to that appropriately. There was a problem there, and they left the circuit breakers then extended or popped so that it would deprive power to that component, eliminating any potential future problem.
Unfortunately, Flight 797's problems are just beginning.
I think it was about an hour and a half into the flight that there was some commotion in the back of the plane. I remember seeing one of the flight attendants take a fire extinguisher to the back. Rumors began going around in the plane that there might be a fire in the trash can, that somebody might have put a cigarette out in the trash.
The captain sends his first officer, Claude Ouimet, to assess the situation.
So I looked back, and you couldn't see the back of the airplane for it was sort of light blue, hazy smoke. And Claude came back, and he said, I don't like what's going on back there. I think we better go down.
The pilots put on their oxygen masks and prepare for an emergency landing into the closest airport, Cincinnati. The crew moves passengers forward in the cabin to get away from the smoke, but there is little else they can do.
Dropping oxygen masks to the passengers in a situation like this would do absolutely no good The masks are designed so that they will take ambient air in and supplement it with oxygen. So even if the oxygen mask had been deployed, when you took a breath in, you're going to get ambient air in.
A flight attendant empties a fire extinguisher trying to control the smoke, but can't find the source of the fire.
When they opened the lavatory door, they could see smoke, but not point of origin. There was an open flame. That was behind the walls. It was in an inaccessible area.
A fire behind the walls is the worst case scenario. It's almost impossible to put out or contain.
Smoke was clearing, and then all of a sudden I lost all my electric power.
That's when the crew realized that they had a life-threatening event on their hands. They needed on the ground as soon as they could possibly get there.
We're under 797, and we're on a main day going down.
Moments later, dense smoke begins to come through the cabin walls.
Roger, can you have time to give me the nature of the emergency? We have a fire in the wash, in the back washroom, and we're filling up with smoke right now.
Filled the cabin very quickly. I would say 10 to 15 minutes. It was horrible. It was so thick that you couldn't see your hand in front of you.
You could feel your lungs and your throat burning from the sensation of breathing in. I suggested that we put our heads lower. In firefighting school, we learned that the lower you got, the more that you could be below the smoke.
With low visibility and few remaining control or navigational systems, Captain Cameron is flying almost blind.
We have no heading, we have no instrument, all we have is a laser right now.
I would have been right up close like this with my eyeball, maybe 3-4 inches away from the window on the left side. At this point, you know you got something serious when you got the thing lit like a Christmas tree. I didn't think about what was burning or what had happened. I just knew that something serious had happened.
Pick in the guys, people on the ground, and we're going to need fire trucks. The trucks are standing by for you, Canada. Can you give me a number of people and amount of fuel? We don't have time. It's getting worse, sir.
You could definitely feel when we started to descend because it was a real dramatic, quick decline. I definitely questioned whether or not we would make it safely to the ground. That's when my fear was probably peaked.
The captain is now totally reliant on air traffic control to guide him down to the airport.
Roger, you're 14 miles southeast of the airport. Continue your left turn. All right, sir. President Hayden is taking you to the field.
He would tell me to turn right until he told me to stop.
He was faced with not being able to see his airspeed, to not be able to see what few instruments he had. It was a very difficult situation to fly.
Where's the airport? 12 o'clock at 8 miles.
As we came in, the airplane wanted to go faster, so it was pitching over, and then you had to stop it with a full force.
Canada 797, you are cleared to land on runway 27 left. For 20 miles, we don't see runway.
After a physically demanding descent, the captain finally gets the airport into view.
Here we have the airport.
4 miles, I think I saw the airport in front of me. The runway was almost lined up perfectly.
The landing is rough. As the plane slams into the ground, all 4 tires explode from the pressure.
Although it was a very hard landing, it wasn't rocky. We came to a firm stop.
But the passengers and crew are not out of danger. Coming up, as passengers try to escape the smoke, the plane bursts into flames.
It looked like an inferno.
Air Canada Flight 797 fills with smoke and loses electrical power before making an emergency landing at Cincinnati Airport. Passengers are desperate to escape the deadly fumes.
As soon as it came to a stop, that's when I removed the door, and Lisa and I both went out onto the wing.
But moments after the exit doors are opened, the plane explodes into flames.
When this additional oxygen entered the cabin with the fire burning, it ignited that smoke.
There were flames leaping out of the door and into the air, probably 6 to 10 feet in the air.
It looked like an inferno. There were flames leaping out the doors, and there was smoke
was in those wing tanks, so I knew that we needed to get off.
As the passengers evacuate, Captain Cameron stays in the cockpit. Relying on the tank of compressed air that supplies his oxygen mask, he begins shutting down the aircraft. But before he can finish, the air runs out.
I couldn't breathe. So I tore the mask off and opened the window, and I saw somebody on the wing. So I thought, good, the evacuation is going well, and then I tried to get up myself, and I couldn't move.
Captain Cameron loses consciousness. Firefighters have to spray him with foam to revive him.
It was ice cold, and it tasted like soap. And the next thing I remembered, I was hanging from the windowsill with my right hand, and I let myself go, and I fell down.
But for some passengers, it's too late.
There were 46 people on board the plane. Half of them were killed. Of those who survived, only 5 were not injured.
We came out on that side of the plane.
On the ground, we started talking to each other. Other people let us know that people sitting next to them had not gotten off the plane.
I mean, I saw the evidence the next day in the hangar, but as far as the enormity of the deaths of that still with me. I feel badly about that still. We couldn't get them all off, but we couldn't.
We thought everybody was off. We thought everybody could get off because, like I say, there wasn't any screams. There wasn't any noise coming from the plane, so you felt that everybody was under control and was getting off.
It was a real mixed bag of emotions. Of course, we were thrilled to have survived such an incredible ordeal, and to realize that some people had not survived was still upsetting.
Immediately after the accident, investigators focus on finding the source of the fire.
The investigators knew early on that they had a fire of likely electrical origin because of the amount of damage done in the lavatory area.
The circuit breakers that popped early in the flight were connected to the flush motor on the aft lavatory, the center of the fire damage. Investigators immediately suspect an arcing event.
The electricity that is flowing through a wire, as over time insulation can chafe, can crack, and these cracks allow the electricity to not flow down the wire path as it's supposed to, but to jump to a part of the frame of the airplane or to another wire that might be exposed.
The lavatory motor is small but carries a lot of power.
Weight on an airplane is something that you try to keep to an absolute minimum. And one of the ways that we do that in aircraft is to utilize very small but very powerful electric motors, so that a very small motor can get 3 boosts of electricity as it winds around.
The motor inside the lavatory is supplied with 3-phase power, which is much stronger than a typical household current. Electricity jumping from one of these wires would release an enormous amount of energy and could ignite a fire. Investigators do find evidence of arcing on the left and right lavatory feeder wires, which come up through holes in the floorboards. The arc starts a fire that ignites the lavatory walls. The fire then spreads, consuming vital electrical systems, making it almost impossible for Captain Cameron to control the aircraft.
It became suddenly very hard to fly. It was nose heavy because the stabilizer trim had failed.
His arms would have been very, very, very tired by the time that he got on the ground. He had expended a lot of physical energy just to keep control of the airplane. He did a really good job. He's a seriously good aviator.
Air Canada says the plane met all existing safety standards. The question now is whether those standards should be made tougher.
With extensive evidence from the aircraft and detailed accounts from the flight crew and passengers, the aviation industry learned some hard lessons.
Changed dramatically the composition of aircraft interiors and seats to be more tolerant of an onboard fire condition. One additional lesson learned was how important floor lighting is to aid passengers in locating ways out of the airplane, where the exits are, and the path to get there.
When I get back on an airplane, Yes, I would. Especially if I had that crew, I'd be no problem whatsoever.
All a fire needs to start is oxygen, fuel, and a heat source. And all three are in plentiful supply on board aircraft. The airline industry has learned hard lessons about in-flight fires. The technology and protocols developed in the wake of these tragedies have made it harder for fires to get out of control. And while smoke and fire may continue to ground flights daily, they are less likely to result in the catastrophic failures of the past.
Why Planes Crash continues at the same time tomorrow. Stay tuned to National Geographic Channel for Ancient X-Files.